John Sullivan, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and former U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, is a partner in Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices and co-lead of that firm's national security practice. He is also a distinguished scholar at the School of Foreign Service at that institution south of here, which is how Jesuits at BC refer to Georgetown University, as well as a distinguished fellow at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He serves as a contributor to the CBS News and is quoted frequently in international media as a leading authority on foreign affairs, and he has written an award-winning, critically acclaimed book, which you can purchase at the back of this room, about his experience as ambassadors, entitled Midnight in Moscow, which was published in August of 2024. Ambassador Sullivan is chairman of the board of the U.S. Institute of Peace after his nomination to the board by President Biden and unanimous confirmation of the Senate. I want to say that again, since we're not likely to hear that. And unanimous confirmation by the Senate. He has also been appointed by Congress to serve as a member of the bipartisan Congressional Commission on Reform and Modernization of the Department of State. The way we will do this tonight is the ambassador will speak for 25 and 30 minutes, and then we'll have we invite 25 or 30 minutes of conversation, questions from you, and our handy senior students will be holding hand mics. So we are honored to have you. Welcome, Ambassador Sullivan.
Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I am a native Bostonian. I'm a proud graduate of Zavarian Brothers High School. Our head of school, Jay Conca, is here in the front row. I'm honored to serve on the school's board of trustees, and we have our board meeting later this week, so I've worn my Zavarian tie for all to see. You know, my remarks, I was asked to give a title of my remarks, and Russia's war against the West. For this audience in this city, I'll paraphrase Mark Twain's novel, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a Boston Irishman in Vladimir Putin's court, in Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, what I saw. I hope we can have a conversation. And I'd like to take as many questions as I can. I'm happy to talk about any and all issues. I will focus on Russia and Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. I went to Russia. I volunteered to go to Russia. And as I wrote in my book, I've had two presidents, Trump and Biden, question my sanity, why I really wanted to go. You really want both? Trump thought Mike Pompeo was trying to fire me, and President Biden just could. Why? You really want to go back? I was home on leave. You really like being there? Yeah. I am at heart a Russophile. I've been talking today to some students and describing my interest in Russia. It starts in 1972. For those of you who are ice hockey fans, I suppose there are a few at Boston College, with the famous summit series between the Soviet Union and Team Canada, continued through the Olympics, if you believe in miracles, in 1980 in Lake Placid. But it was more than just a fascination with Soviet hockey, Russian athletics, fascinated by Russian history, Russian culture. I am not a historian or necessarily an expert on Russia, but I am an amateur Russophile, and I have the receipts to prove that. My first trip outside of the northeastern United States with my wife, and I'm not like Bernie Sanders, it wasn't our honeymoon, but our first trip after our honeymoon was to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1989 for 6 weeks. We went to Moscow, Leningrad, what we then called Kiev, and Yalta. And I treated it and spoke of it as a trip to the Soviet Union. I knew, but it didn't really matter to me, that I was going first to Russia, and then for Moscow and Leningrad, and then to Ukraine for Kiev. Now the Ukrainian pronunciation is preferred Kyiv, and Yalta, which is on the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. I say all of that as to try to provide some of my bona fides as a Russophile, because what I have to say about the Russian Federation and really about its government is very hostile. Russia is an enemy of the United States. Not my word. That's Vladimir Putin's word. He says the United States is an enemy of the Russian Federation, the Russian people. The United States, according to Putin, has started a war against Russia in Ukraine, and that is why Putin had to launch the so-called special military operation on February 24th, 2022, as a response to the war, Putin's word, that the United States started against Russia. That is the land of disinformation, misinformation that I lived and served the United States as ambassador from late 2019 to 2022. I talk a lot, almost every day, about Russia and Russia-Ukraine, and it is, I have a usual stump speech, so to speak, and in some ways I'm like a stand-up comedian, except it's more like stand-up horror. Because what the Russians have done, what Putin has done, is to wage an aggressive war, the likes of which the world hasn't seen very much of, particularly since September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland, started World War II, reached an agreement, which the Russians don't like to talk about, a pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union with a secret protocol that divided Poland between a German sphere and a Soviet sphere, and gave the Baltic countries to the Soviet Union, to Stalin. What Putin's done in February of 2022, I maintain, and I write in my book, is legally, for those from the law school, my thanks for those coming from the law school, I believe is legally and in many ways factually indistinguishable from what the Germans did on September 1st, 1939. Let me put this in context. August 1939, we have a German, he's now Führer, he's not just Chancellor, he's both Chancellor and President. He's the German leader. But he leads a country that is just rife with grievances, growing out of the Great War, growing out of the Treaty of Versailles. So there are reparations, there's solitary war guilt. Germany loses not only its colonies, but 10% of its European landmass. And there's a phony border in Hitler's estimation. And Hitler himself, by the way, Corporal Hitler, decorated veteran of the Great War, maintains that the German Empire, the Imperial German Army, didn't lose the Great War. It was a great stab in the back. You've all heard that expression in Berlin. As a result, the German army is forced to surrender, return, disarm, and there's this phony border created in the east, separating Germany, prime German heartland, and what Hitler would call his Volk, our Volk, German Volk, on the wrong side. This is East Prussia, on the wrong side of a phony border created out of a war that Germany didn't lose. And what's happening to his German Volk while he's Chancellor, while he's Führer, is that they're subject to Polish, his word, barbarism. Back in the late 30s, people didn't talk in terms of genocide. The word he used was barbarism. He created a pretext for launching a war, creating a phony crisis, engaging in sham diplomacy, extending back through 1938 with the Sudeten crisis, continuing through the last week of August of 1939, and he launches an aggressive war to seize territory from Poland because, among other things, he needs to rescue his Volk, who are the subject of Polish barbarism. Let's fast forward to 2021-22. We have a decorated veteran of the Cold War. He's not as good as people think he was, because he was Lieutenant Colonel Putin in the KGB, assigned to Dresden for 7 years. He is fluent in German, and he's a career KGB man, make no mistake about that. But if he were really that good, he would have been Colonel Putin, and he would have been serving in East Berlin. So we'll get that stated at the outset. He is, as I said, he is a Chekist. He is a career KGB man, and he is committed to all that means, which is the Cheka was the original secret police of the revolution, created by Lenin, headed first, ironically enough, by a Pole, descended from Polish nobility, Catholic nobility, Dzerzhinsky, and the Cheka was not bound by law, was not bound by morals, was bound only to the success of the revolution, defeating class enemies, and protecting Lenin and in his person who was the revolution. And they draw on a history over centuries, going back to the Oprichniki, Ivan the Terrible's secret police, or the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. That's the milieu in which Putin develops professionally. He goes to the KGB in Leningrad as a young man to volunteer his services, and he's told, you don't come to us, we find you. Be on your way, son. And he says, what should I do in the interim to prepare myself? I really want to become an officer in the KGB. They said, well, go to law school. So for those of you like me who are lawyers, I say on behalf of myself, it always embarrasses me when Putin points out that he himself is trained as a lawyer, because he's never really acted like a lawyer. He will justify what he does by citing law, but he's not bound by law. He's a Chekist. He's a KGB man. He will tell you that there is no such thing as a former KGB man. So he believes that the Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War. The Soviet Union was betrayed by communists. Putin's not a communist. The Soviet Union was betrayed by communists like Gorbachev in the 80s, including into the early 90s, a great stab in the back, if you will. And as a result, the Soviet Union, in fact, loses the Cold War. He feels this to his core, the way Corporal Hitler did, having served, been injured, been decorated for valor on the Western Front. Putin feels the same way about the Cold War. I was told by a prominent Russian scholar that we Americans, this is after I had arrived as ambassador, that we Americans underestimate the wound to the Russian psyche of losing the Cold War. And Putin feels that to his core. So there's a war they didn't lose, and the parallels continue. Think about the consequences of that war. As I said, Putin's not a communist. He's a Russian nationalist. He's famously said, it must be difficult to be a multi-billionaire and be a communist, which is what Putin is. He's not a communist. He's famously said about communism, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to Soviet communism, you don't have a brain. No, the great tragedy, as he's described it, of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union, was the demise of control over the Soviet Empire from Moscow. What happened? 15 Soviet republics, the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union, become international borders, separating what Putin calls, particularly in Western Russia, the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And he views Belarus and Ukraine as that core, particularly with Ukraine, with the history of, of Kievan Rus. This is the equivalent of Hitler saying, Prussia, our Prussian homeland, Our Volk, we're separated by this phony border in the east. Putin's got a phony border in the west that's separating the Russian people from their fellow Russians in Ukraine. And in the run-up to the war, what does he say? It's like Polish barbarism, except he uses the word genocide. It's a genocide, false, a genocide against Russian speakers, Russian culture, the Russian people in Ukraine on the wrong side of a phony border growing out of a war that the Soviet Union and Russia did not lose. And just as Hitler was lying about Polish barbarism against his folk, Putin is lying about a genocide by Ukraine, the Ukrainian government against Russians in Ukraine. How do I know that? The International Court of Justice, by a vote of 13-2, 15 members of the court, opined on the issue. More than half of the judges, there's one American judge, more than half of the judges are not allies or partners of the United States. So there are 13 votes that say there is no genocide by Ukraine against Russians. The two judges who voted in favor of that proposition are from the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. There's no genocide against Russians in Ukraine. That's the premise of Putin's war against Ukraine. The other premise is, I'm sure you've all heard this, relentless eastern expansion of NATO. I mean, it sounds like, if you listen to what the Russians say, it sounds like the Wehrmacht rolling east at the start of Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. You would think that NATO had invaded Eastern Europe. The history, in fact, and this goes to the core of why what Putin is doing is so dangerous and why it threatens the United States and our national security, in my opinion. He says that the people, the hundreds of millions of people in Eastern Europe, they don't get to decide their future. The security arrangements they want for their country, whether it's Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, they've been conquered, this is in Putin's view, by NATO. And that is as wrong as his assertion that there's a genocide by a Nazi regime in Kyiv against Russians in Ukraine. A Nazi regime, by the way, headed by a Jew whose grandfather fought for the Red Army against the Nazis. Gives you a sense of how untethered to the truth Putin and his government is. He says, there's this relentless expansion east by NATO. In fact, in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was debated in Western capitals. Should we in the West, to be sure led by the United States, admit these countries from Eastern Europe, particularly former Soviet republics like the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, admit them to NATO? Why did we do that? Because the position of the tens of millions, over 100 million Eastern Europeans who had lived under the thumb of either the Soviet Union directly, if they were Soviet republics, or the Warsaw Pact, if they were in Poland, Bulgaria, they were looking west. Their people decided, as uncertain as this world is now, as uncertain as that behemoth is to our east in Moscow, we want to be members of the EU. We want to be members of NATO. They looked west. It wasn't NATO marching east. And Putin is saying those people can't make that choice because it makes me uncomfortable. And he's saying the same thing today about Ukraine. Ukraine can't decide for itself that it wants to be a member, the Ukrainian people. They want to be members of the EU. They want to be members of NATO. That makes us in the Kremlin feel uncomfortable. You in the West are continuing this westward steamroller of NATO. What's really happening is Putin and his government substituting their will, their views, for the people of Ukraine's views. And under international law, under the UN Charter, under any sense of common decency and morality, that's not right. But that's what's happening. We see this to this day, since the war started. Putin's war aims have not changed. His war aims, there are two. It's before the war started, and I'd be happy to talk about this later, my views on this. Before the war started, what Putin really wanted, and we can talk about how long ago his views hardened, that he was going to achieve what I will now offer to you my view on what he wants. He wanted Ukraine to be like Belarus is today. Belarus and the Russian Federation form what is called the Union State. The president of Belarus, recently reelected, and the entire country is dominated by Moscow. It's not part of the Russian Federation. It doesn't have a large military. Its security services, they still maintain the KGB moniker. It's Belarusian KGB, BKGB. The Belarusian military isn't that large. Among the reasons that Belarus hasn't participated in the special military operation with the Russian Federation, their military isn't that big. Their security services are huge. That's what he wants. That's what ultimately he wanted Ukraine to be. And the Union State then becomes Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, the so-called Triune Rus, the core of this Russian empire that Putin is looking to reestablish. It was lost when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that's what's at the goal, what he's trying to do here. So I maintain that sometime before, at least before the date that Biden met with Putin in June of 2021, Putin had decided that he was going to bring Ukraine to heel in one of two ways. Either Ukraine would capitulate, or he would use what the Russians call military technical means, which is their invasion. And I can go into detail, I write about this in the book, why I believe this, the evidence of what I saw. I was with President Biden when he met with Putin in Geneva on June 16th, 2021. Putin has been planning to do this for a while. If he could have achieved his goal of creating that passive, dominated by Moscow country of Ukraine, he might have settled for that rather than starting a war. But he wasn't going to get that because the Ukrainian people weren't going to capitulate. Even if Zelensky wanted to, he would not have remained as president if he were going to capitulate to Russia's goals for Ukraine. So the war starts, and at the very start of the war, Putin says there are two war goals: to denazify Ukraine and demilitarize Ukraine. So denazify means remove the government in Kyiv, remove the Nazi cabal headed by the Ukrainian Jewish president Zelensky, denazify, and demilitarize. So eliminate the military strength that Ukraine has developed over the years, in part, increasingly over the years, with support from the United States and fellow NATO allies, but reduce the Russian military to the size of the Belarusian military, not a threat to Russia, a small constabulary force. And as a matter of Ukraine's security policy and foreign policy, it is to remain neutral. It will never become a member of NATO, and almost as important, never become a member of the EU. And these are Putin's war aims when the war started. I would add, as over the almost 3 years now that the war has proceeded, there's a related war aim that I don't believe was at the core of what Putin wanted when he started this special military operation. And that is to absorb Ukrainian territory into the Russian Federation. But now, because the special military operation failed in the first year at least, and has stalled in trying to regain territory in Ukraine at huge cost to the Russian Federation, to the Russian military, to the Russian people, hundreds of thousands of casualties. Putin can't surrender territory that Russia has seized, and after sham elections, the Russians claim that Ukrainians voted in those oblasts, in the Donbass, to join the Russian Federation. They are now, in Putin's view, part of the Russian Federation. And the Russian Constitution, which Putin amended in 2020, makes it unconstitutional for Putin or any Russian leader to alienate territory that is legally part of the Russian Federation. So Putin would say, the lawyer that Putin is, my hands are tied. You want me to give back part of the Donbass? We've already incorporated it into the Russian Federation. It's unconstitutional. I can't do it. Non-negotiable. So Russia's war against the West. He views us as the enemy that is preventing him from achieving his imperial goals with respect to Ukraine. And they don't end there. Ukraine is the biggest prize for recreating the Russian Empire that was ruled over by the Tsars. The current foreign minister of Russia says that people always wonder who's in Putin's inner circle. And Foreign Minister Lavrov was asked, who are the advisors that Putin relies on the most? And Lavrov said there were three: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. I mean, this is the Russian Empire. And he views it, and Kennan, it's interestingly enough, I was talking to a group of students earlier. George Kennan, who was deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the mid-40s, and then briefly ambassador to the Soviet Union in the early 50s, writes famously a so-called long telegram, a diplomatic cable to Washington, and then expands on it in an article in Foreign Affairs. And he uses interchangeably Russia and the Soviet Union. So Kennan himself, who was the preeminent expert in the U.S. government on the Soviet Union and Russia, doesn't distinguish between Russia and the Soviet Union. Putin doesn't either. Now, Kennan had a reason for doing that because he's basing it on the views of earlier generations of people like Putin, the Russian nationalists, who view the Soviet Union through the prism of, they call it control from the center, from Moscow. And that's how they view the Soviet Union, as a continuation in communist form, to be sure, of the Russian Empire that had been ruled over for several centuries by the Tsars. So Putin is looking to reestablish that. In the West, we in the West, in addition to the Ukrainian people, are standing in his way. He has been waging this war for long before February of 2022. When I became Deputy Secretary of State in early 2017, I was told by my counterparts in Warsaw, in Vilnius, in Riga, that they were already involved in a hybrid war against Russia, and that we in the United States didn't understand what the Russians were doing to them. I maintain today that Russia is in a hybrid war with the United States. Putin himself now says not just that we're an enemy, but that we are engaged and we are directing the Ukrainians to engage in war by proxy against the Russian Federation, that we are at war with Russia. So that's in part the war against the West. He says he's responding to it. In fact, he's initiated a war against the West, and it's not just against Eastern European countries. Think about this. Putin, certainly at his direction, sent an FSB, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB split. The biggest part of it became the FSB, the Federal Security Service. There's a smaller Foreign Intelligence Service. The FSB is responsible not just for security within the Russian Federation, but in the so-called Russian near abroad, which are the former Soviet republics of, in the Baltic states and so forth. And, the jurisdiction is a little unclear, the former Warsaw Pact countries. Putin sends an FSB colonel to assassinate a political opponent in Berlin, on the streets of Berlin, in front of innocent people. His name is Krasikov. He was released in that big prisoner exchange between the Russian Federation and several Western countries that got my friend Paul Whelan released. Putin sends Krasikov to commit murder on the streets of Berlin in front of innocent people. The former Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was beside herself that Putin had the audacity to do that to Germany and to her. But it's worse than that, and it goes back in time. He sent GRU, military intelligence, GRU officers to Salisbury, England, to poison a political opponent. And the GRU officers who were given that task wound up poisoning other people, or killing at least one other person, poisoning a number of police officers. The target of the assassination survived, but the UK had to close down a big chunk of the city of Salisbury. I cite these as examples. Look, this goes back in time to the Soviet Union. You know, think of what happened to Trotsky in Mexico City with an ice pick. But at least then they had the common decency to not have it be a Russian who did it. Now, Putin doesn't care. He's at war with us. And until we recognize that, we will fail in diplomacy and negotiations with the Russian Federation. He's not interested in negotiations. Now, people misunderstand that. They think I'm saying we shouldn't talk to the Russians. We need to talk to the Russians, and we need to listen to what they tell us. That's important. That's part of diplomacy. But I guarantee you go to my former colleagues at the State Department and talk about a negotiating position for the United States and how we should negotiate with Putin and the Russian Federation, and we will be on a path toward failure. Among the first things I guarantee someone will say is, as a good faith gesture, we should, and that's when a person like me bangs on the table and said, there are no good faith gestures. Whatever we offer will be pocketed by the Russians and used against us. They will interpret it as a sign of weakness. So I've laid out in my book how I think we should approach this big problem that the world has with Russia. It's a 21st century form of containment. And for those who are still unconvinced, I've made this prediction, and I'm pretty confident in it. If it hasn't happened already, Putin is going to execute someone, an opponent, in the United States. I know that they have made plans for that. I can't go into detail. Imagine they use a Novichok nerve agent in South Beach in Miami, and part of Miami gets shut down, and maybe a few Americans get killed. That's what happened in Salisbury. I guarantee you, he has such contempt for the United States and for his opponents. I guarantee you, if it hasn't happened already, and he may not go so far as to actually task an active duty colonel in the FSB or colonel in the GRU. Maybe he'll use a Spaniard or a Swiss like they did in the old days, or a Mexican, a third-party national. But I guarantee you he will do that if given the opportunity. If he hasn't done it already, and we just haven't been able to uncover the Russian fingerprints. So I am now getting from father to stop. So,
very much, Ambassador. I was wondering how you see this war resolving itself and what implications the new Trump administration has towards ending this conflict.
The short answer to your question is that it won't resolve itself. There may be a ceasefire. We may or may not be successful in coming to a ceasefire with the Russian Federation. My hope, don't misunderstand me. I pray, honestly, all of my Ukrainian friends, I hope the violence stops immediately. But Putin won't stop. His war aims won't change. I had a conversation with Secretary Blinken. I was home on leave. This was it was after the war had started. And we were comparing notes about, questions we were getting from the press. And we're getting bombarded by, what are the off-ramps for Putin? All wars end in negotiations. What are the off-ramps? And I said to the secretary, you'd only appreciate this if you come from the Northeast United States. I said, he doesn't want an off-ramp. He may take a rest area, a service area, like on the New Jersey Turnpike, like the Vince Lombardi service area, but there's no off-ramp. He's on a highway to achieve his goals. He will use a ceasefire to regroup, refit, but he cannot change his war aims. Given the sacrifices the Russians and the Russian people have made, he cannot change his war aims unless he is absolutely compelled to do so. And even then, it is going to be difficult for him. He cannot do what Lyndon Johnson did in 1968. After the Tet Offensive, when the Vietnam War, after Johnson sends 500,000 American military personnel to Vietnam, and the Tet Offensive happens, and Johnson realizes that, my God, this is a problem for me. It's a huge problem for the United States. He announces that he's not going to run for re-election. He retires to the LBJ ranch. He grows his hair long, gives interviews. Putin can't do that. He can't survive. He can't leave office. My former boss, Secretary Tillerson, always said, the problem for Putin is not staying in office. It is, if he decides to leave, how he stays alive after leaving office. So I don't have happy news about the future. If there is a long-term ceasefire, I think the best that we in the West could hope for would be something like the bloodshed we continued to see in my grandparents' homeland, Ireland, in Ulster, in Belfast, between the Catholics and Protestants. So much has happened. So many people have been killed. There is so much, the vengeance that the Ukrainian people want. And on the other hand, the Russian people have sacrificed hundreds of thousands of what they call their boys. This isn't going to, in my opinion, this isn't going to end with this isn't a border dispute that's going to be solved by measuring latitude and longitude on a map. This is much bigger than that. Yeah. Yeah, great question. Yeah, and it ties in. Yeah, so it was a comparison between Belarus, which is now a union state with Russia, and another important country in the Balkans, Serbia, right? Slavic sisters and brothers in Serbia, as with Russia, similar for Belarus. Belarus is under Putin's thumb. There's no doubt about that. When Lukashenko, the president of Ukraine, was reelected, and this was August 9th of 2020, I was ambassador, and I was tasked by the U.S. government to deliver a message to Putin and to Lavrov to not send Russian troops into Belarus as Lukashenko was crushing popular protests against the sham election that he had held. And what was interesting, and I reported this back to Washington, was the reaction of the Russians. Lavrov just looked at, why would we possibly do that? Now, he says the same thing days before they invade Ukraine, but back in August of 2020, he meant it, and I thought he meant it. And what he was saying was, we don't need to do that. We replaced some people in the Belarusian state media with better trained communicators, manipulators from the FSB and our state media. Belarus, we're not going to send Russian troops into Belarus. Now, Serbia is a different story. Serbia is not as much under the thumb of the Russian Federation, but there are a lot of dependencies, including Serbs who identify with Russia, fellow Slavs, and that's a problem. But it's not just Serbia, it's Moldova, and they're not, Georgia. So this conquest of empire that Putin is engaged in, he's already at work in Georgia, is already at work in Moldova, already at work in Serbia. The work's done in Belarus. Those are the targets that are, in my opinion, that are next.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. There were reports, I believe, in the fall that while out of office, President Trump and Putin communicated, I believe, 7 or 8 times in private messages and meetings. What do you make of those meetings? What do you think they were about? And how do you think they will impact American foreign policy as President Trump is now in office?
So I'm skeptical that they happened because the story that broke, if you'll recall, the story was at the same time, it was on the book War by Bob Woodward. And the two stories that came out of the book that broke on the same morning. And I know I serve as a consultant to CBS News, and my phone explodes when something happens with respect to Russia. So I'm awakened early in the morning. Trump spoke to Putin, and Trump sent medical testing devices to Putin for COVID. On that latter point, on the testing devices, I'm pretty confident that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. And it I think reveals a little bit about Putin's psyche. First, the story was allegedly that Putin said, can you give me testing devices, but let's not make it public. Vladimir Putin, he doesn't ask for things. He tells people things. And he's certainly not going to ask the United States, given how much he was trying at the time, bolster the medical establishment and their Sputnik V vaccine. He's never going to suggest that he needed something from the United States. And he would never say in a conversation with the United States president, whether it's Trump or Biden or whomever, and let's just keep this between us, with all the people who are monitoring that call. So that struck me as absurd. I don't believe there have been mixed messages. I think Trump and Putin have at various times denied that they spoke. I'm skeptical that it happened. How the story about the medical testing devices came about, I don't know. I don't know how the story about the calls occurred. I'm skeptical that it happened. And going back to the testing devices, I was ambassador when the Russian Federation and the United States exchanged ventilators. You remember there was a shortage of ventilators at the start of the pandemic. Russia sent ventilators to the United States, like 200 in April of 2020. And then we sent, I think it was 500 in 2 shipments in May and June. I write about this in my book. And it was, there was debate, should we be doing this? It turned out that the Russian ventilators, shortly after Putin and Trump had talked about it, it became widely known in Moscow, in Russia, that the ventilators used in Russian hospitals were a fire hazard, and a number of people were killed in fires in hospitals using those ventilators. So the 200 ventilators that came in at Kennedy Airport on that Aeroflot cargo plane all got put into storage, and I think they were ultimately destroyed because they were dangerous. The ventilators we sent didn't catch fire, were useful, and it was an interesting, gives you try to convey a little bit of a sense of the average Russian's perspective on the United States as opposed to the Americans' perspective on Russia. Obsession's too strong a word. We are a fascination for Russia. The United States, if we're not the lead story on every news program, not flattering news stories to be sure, we're the lead story or the second story on every news program in Russia. The average Russian knows more about the political establishment and the politics of the United States than I think the average American does. They really know a lot about it. So I go as ambassador to greet the C-17 that flies in from Germany. And the people at the airport, and this was outside of Moscow, Vnukovo Airport, like, they see this huge U.S. C-17 cargo plane flying up. And people were just gawking at it. Aeroflot landing at Kennedy, who cares? The average American, yeah, they've probably heard of Putin. They could, because it's so big, they could probably pick Russia out on a map. They have no idea what Russia is trying to do to the United States, or that Putin may be trying to assassinate somebody on the streets of Boston in such a reckless way that an innocent American could be shot or poisoned. They don't understand that.
So thank you, Ambassador, for coming. In your comparison of Hitler and Putin, I was just wondering, I believe one of the reasons that Hitler was so successful, at least initially, was because his ideology was very popular among German citizens. And the same be said about Putin and the average Russian citizen. And if not, does he face like legitimate threats of domestic unrest, even if public opposition?
Good question. So I'll finish my comparison with the German preparations for war, preparing the German people for war that Hitler knew he was going to launch. Fun fact, it's illegal still in the Russian Federation to call what's happening in Ukraine a war, an invasion. It's a special military operation that was launched against a war that the United States started. Disinformation, misinformation. Do you know what the German propaganda ministry under Goebbels, the edict that was issued on August 31st, 1939, was? To not refer to the German invasion of Poland that was coming, this is the German state media, as a war or an invasion. Only after the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd was it okay to call it a war. So the Germans prepared the German people for the war that Hitler was going to launch. I quote, Hermann Goering is interviewed by an American Army psychologist after the war at Nuremberg. And I'll paraphrase that. I've got the quote in my book. He says, the average farmer in Prussia, he doesn't want to go to war. What's the most he's going to get out of a war? Maybe he'll come back with all his limbs and go back to his farm. He has to be led into war. And that's how the Germans led the German people into war. You create an enemy and you motivate the German people not only to despise the enemy, but to despise fellow Germans who don't despise that enemy. And that's how Goering said the Nazis prepared the Germans. Putin's doing the same thing. When he says the United States is the enemy, he's not talking to Washington. He's talking to the Russian people. How effective he'll be, I don't know. We'll have to see. 700,000 casualties, which is the latest estimate from the U.S. Department of Defense, killed and wounded for Russian military in Ukraine. That's probably not a breaking point. Putin certainly doesn't think so. I don't know that Putin has a breaking point himself personally. His view is, think of the millions we lost to liberate Ukraine from the Nazis. 700,000? Nothing. That's not the same calculation that the Russian people make. There'll come a point where the casualties are too great. He fiddles with the rules on conscription and mobilization. They recruit in prisons. He's got manpower issues because of the massive casualties they're taking. And he's trying to avoid wide-scale conscription because that would be really unpopular. And that's where his political base might say, that's too much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good to see you again. What really struck me in the book was the intelligence sharing between the United States and Russia, specifically the United States sharing information with Russia about thwarting possible terrorist attacks. And you said in your book that you would rather see innocent lives lost in St. Petersburg than in Boston, which of course is admirable. And I was that really struck me. And of course, Russia didn't return the favor really. And I was wondering, is that just a gesture of good faith on the part of the United States? Is it hoping it'll move the needle a bit? And is that still happening after Russia has launched this war?
I'm as patriotic an American as you're going to find, but I'm not a blind patriot. I mean, the United States is far from perfect. But on counterterrorism cooperation, I don't care. If innocent Russians are going to be killed on the streets of St. Petersburg or Moscow or Vladivostok, I'm all for FBI, CIA sharing that information, which we continue to do. And I said I led one of the agreements that Putin and President Trump made when they met in Helsinki was to establish a so-called counterterrorism dialogue, which I talked about in my book, and just show you how the Russians work. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State. At the time, there was only one. The Russians have 10 deputy foreign ministers, and one of those deputy foreign ministers is responsible for counterterrorism generally. What's his background? KGB. He's interesting. You think about, nationality and ethnicity. Born in Riga, born in Latvia, now when it was a Soviet republic, to Russian parents, joins gets an aeronautical engineering degree and joins an instrument of the Russian security services of the KGB, which is Aeroflot, their national airline. There's nothing in Russia that isn't used as an instrument by the security services. So this guy's name is Siromolotov, all one word, Oleg Siromolotov. He could play offensive line for the BC football team, like 6'5", huge bear of a man, chain smoker, liked to hug me. And every time he hugged me and pressed, I could feel the cigarette smoke come out of his clothes. But this is an FSB guy. And I said to him in front of his entire team as a Bostonian, I gave him my spiel about how we in the United States, I as an American, confident of speaking on behalf of every right-thinking American, we don't want to see innocent people killed in Russia. And I quite pointedly referred to the Boston Marathon bombing and said, and by the same token, I would hope you would try to work harder to make sure that another American like Martin Richard, the 8-year-old boy who was vaporized by the Tsarnaev's bomb at the marathon, that something like that doesn't happen in an American city. And it is a fact. The Russians provided, the FSB provided some information in advance of the Boston Marathon bombing. We, in U.S. law enforcement, followed up, got no response, and the Boston Marathon bombing happened. So our experience, the FBI it's beyond skeptical about, they think it's a waste of time engaging with the Russians on, or expecting anything from the Russians in a counterterrorism dialogue. So we stopped that dialogue because it's not a two-way street. We don't expect anything from them. But to our credit, we will continue, and we have provided actionable intelligence that has, and by that I mean has prevented terrorist attacks in Russian cities. And we will, I am confident President Biden did that, and I'm confident President Trump did it in his first term, and we will continue to do that. And we should expect, and we will, I am also confident, get nothing like that in return from the Russians.
Thank you so much for being here, Ambassador. Do you feel that there are any mechanisms, legal or otherwise, that the U.S. and other maybe intergovernmental organizations can really use to potentially encourage a ceasefire and perhaps even through Russia's proxy wars happening in the Middle East and elsewhere?
Well, you know what's interfered with Russia's proxy wars elsewhere has been developments in Syria. And it's a very simple logistical reason. Unlike the U.S. military, which has naval stations, air bases around the world with allies, the Russians don't. The Russians can't project military power. They can't fly an aircraft from Moscow, a cargo aircraft, to a distant point in sub-Saharan Africa, which is why their air base in Syria, and particularly their naval base at Tartus in Syria, both of which they've been kicked out of, is a real problem for them, because they're not going to be able to resupply. It's going to, well, that's overstating it. It will be more challenging and more costly for them to resupply their proxies, the successors to Wagner, the Africa Corps, whatever they call themselves now. By the way, think of that. This is a Russian private military corporation, which is endorsed by the Russian government. And as much as Putin rails about Nazis and Nazism and the Great Patriotic War, a lot of the people Russians who founded Wagner, think about that. Wagner, SS tattoos on their necks, these are Russians. This is their proxy in Africa. And they're going to have trouble. It's going to be difficult for them to support those proxies without those bases in Syria, which is why Syria was so important to Putin. So as for other ways to try to particularly focused on Ukraine, the UN, unfortunately, the Security Council, and my State Department colleagues get upset with me because I'm just stating a fact. The UN Security Council is not going to help. With the veto by Russia and seconded by the PRC, I will contrast that with the way that the rules-based international order, to use Washington's favorite lingo, and particularly the UN used to work or should work, is another aggressive war, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. Everyone remembers Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 500,000 U.S. troops sent to the Gulf, defending the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, expelling Iraq from what it claimed as its 19th province, Kuwait. What's overlooked is that military operation, first of all, it was a coalition of 37 nations. That military action to expel Iraq from Kuwait by military force was authorized by multiple UN Security Council resolutions. The Soviet Union, occupying the seat of the Soviet Union, five permanent members, United States, France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, the PRC. Russia voted in favor, and the PRC abstained. That will never happen again. Never. So we have these General Assembly resolutions. There have been multiple. My former colleagues at the time when I was ambassador, my colleagues at our mission to the UN, did a fantastic job organizing over 140 countries. If you read the text of the resolution, that those 143, however many it was, countries, they deplored and condemned the special military operation and told the Russians to withdraw their troops from Ukraine. But it wasn't worth the paper that it was written on or the electrons that appeared on the screen. There's no enforcement mechanism. So Putin is not going to be swayed or cowed by an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. I mean, that's in some ways for him and Putin voters a badge of honor. It interferes with his international travel. He doesn't like that. He doesn't care about war crimes. He doesn't care about the ICC. Well, he cares about war crimes only in the following sense. The average Putin voter, the average Russian nationalist, and by the way, this is, 140 million Russians, most of them outside of the Moscow-St. Petersburg corridor. The average Russian is a patriot, doesn't want to see the Russian military slaughtered in Ukraine because of corrupt or alcoholic or stupid generals who were getting themselves killed for lack of discipline in using cell phones on the battlefield. They don't want to see, as they call them, their boys slaughtered. But you know what else? They don't want to see their boys committing real war crimes. They don't want to see their boys, zip tying the hands of elderly men and women behind their backs and shooting them in the back of the head. That's not a good look for the average. They don't want their boys doing that. That's the only reason. Putin doesn't care that those innocent people are being killed. He doesn't care that the West thinks that that's a war crime or the ICC wants to arrest him. That's where he can lose domestic support. If he can't control the Russian military in Ukraine, and they're either the soldiers themselves are getting slaughtered or they are slaughtering innocent Slavic sisters and brothers, which is what Putin says they are, that's a problem for him. By the way, while we're waiting, this is why I started my remarks with my why I'm a Russophile. I love Russia. I love the Russian people, Russian culture, Russian history. The warmest ones. I've got so many Russian friends. I'm a big fan of. I spoke to the hockey team earlier today, Soviet hockey. But this government, led by Putin, is as bad as it gets. One more question.
Slightly looking to the future, I just want to know what you would think will happen in Russia after Putin either leaves office or dies, and who do you think will succeed him?
Yeah, so this isn't just about Putin. There is, and Kennan writes about this more eloquently than I ever could, there is this strain of Russian history, their exposure, particularly in Western Russia, to both threats from the West and threats from the East, the paranoia that feeds into the Russian nationalism. It's a whole lot bigger than just Putin. If Putin had a stroke tonight and didn't wake up tomorrow morning, the war doesn't end, right? It's just, just as Roosevelt dies, Second World War continues, right? So what does that mean for succession? I can't tell you how many Russians I met, generation, Z Russians, as they call themselves. Z is the symbol that the Russian military used for identification purposes in the special military operation in Ukraine, who still have some affection for the West. They're not quite as rabid as some of the other Russian nationalists are. And they're the people who are looking toward, who would ask me when I was ambassador, when is it going to go back to the way it was before February 22? It's a couple of questions I got earlier about, when's the war going to end? When's it going to go back to being the way it used to be? And my answer has been, it's not going to happen anytime soon. But they would simultaneously, with asking me that question, would say, don't think this is just about Putin, and be careful, for the person who replaces Putin may be worse than he is. And they would cite instances where Putin was a check on. Now, the examples they would cite were often in pre-special military operation, and would have been destructive to the Russian economy, and that Putin was exercising more rational control over some of the more rabid nationalists. But I take their warning seriously. This is not a question, I write about this in my book, this is not a question of regime change in Moscow. Is it going to change what the Russian government does? First of all, it's none of the business of the United States. We are terrible at trying to effectuate regime change. And I quote in my book, and I'll paraphrase him here, Churchill, and this was during the Russian Civil War. No fan of the Soviet Union and Soviet communism. He said, and I paraphrase, if Russia is to be saved, and I pray that she will be, it will be saved by Russians. And the Russian people have to make these decisions, and just replacing Putin isn't going to convince a lot of Russians that the war he started, his government started, is wrong.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador.